Welcome to this session on poverty in America. My name is Jerry Powers. I'm Director of Catholic Peacebuilding Studies at the Kroc Institute for Peace Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. And we have two distinguished speakers for this session. Professor Peter Edelman is co-director of the Joint Degree in Law and Public Policy and faculty director for the Center on Poverty, Inequality, and Public Policy at Georgetown Law School. He has dedicated his professional life to working on issues of poverty and race and is one of this country's leading experts on the welfare system. His commitment to addressing the scandal of endemic poverty in America was forged as a top advisor to Senator Robert F. Kennedy from 1964 to 1968. He reflected on those years and RFK's legacy in his 2001 book, Searching for America's Heart, RFK and the Renewal of Hope. Professor Edelman served as Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services in the Clinton administration until he resigned in protest after the president signed the 1996 Welfare Reform Bill. In an award-winning article in the Atlantic Monthly, Edelman characterized the welfare reform law as, quote, a war on the poor of the United States, unquote, and the worst thing Bill Clinton had done as president. Professor Edelman has co-authored or authored 10 books and dozens of articles. His most recent book, So Rich, So Poor, Why It's So Hard to End Poverty in America, was published by the New Press in May 2012. John Carr is the director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. He is also Washington correspondent for America Magazine. Prior to moving to Georgetown, he served for almost 25 years as head of the Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And in the last 10 years, he also served as head of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. In a famous speech during the congressional debate over welfare reform in 1996, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the recognized expert in Congress on the issue, commended the U.S. bishops for being one of the only voices in Washington who day in and day out took a principled stand on behalf of the poor and marginalized. We can, to a large degree, thank John Carr for that. Over the past 3 decades, no one has done more to help the Church in the United States maintain its commitment to social and economic justice and to act in a principled, politically effective manner on the most pressing issues of our times, from abortion and health care to poverty and workers' rights. Now, you might have noticed that I have gray hair, even though I'm such a young man. I worked for John Carr for 17 years. He once introduced me as all substance and no style. I'm tempted to say that John Carr is all style and no substance. The only problem is that, as you'll soon see, I'd be lying. John will begin.
Before I hired Jerry, I had hair. It's a pleasure to be here at Notre Dame. It is a great place. 85 years ago, 85, it seems that long, 45 years ago, I was a college freshman in seminary. And I really had my first exposure to the poor on this campus, where I served as a counselor in the Upward Bound program and saw firsthand in young African-American men some of the challenges they face. I am very honored to be here. I'm honored to be with Jerry. I'm very honored to be with Peter Edelman. His work for Robert Kennedy and the Clinton administration, and now as a passionate voice to the poor, for the poor, makes him the right person to make this presentation. I'm honored to be a part of this distinguished gathering. I am a newcomer to this. I am a little anxious. I am not an expert like Peter is. Nobody's given me a Nobel Prize. I have spent my life trying to help the church apply its social teaching to issues. I'm relatively new to academic life, Before I went to Georgetown, my relationship with Jesuit education is I paid for it. And I said to one of my Jesuit friends, the way the Jesuits practice the option for the poor is by making me poor. Among the perspectives I bring, I come from a mixed marriage. We're going to be talking about politics and public policy. My mother is from St. Paul, my dad from Minneapolis. Peter knows that that's a bigger deal than you do. But more importantly, my mother's family, very active Republicans. My uncle was the Republican leader of the Minnesota State Senate. My dad and his family, diehard Democrats. My grandfather was Hubert Humphrey's finance chairman when he ran for mayor. For many of the people in the room, I'll tell you, Hubert Humphrey was vice president of the United States and came from Minnesota. So I learned at an early age that we can express our values and act on our faith in different ways. This is my first time at this distinguished conference, and I feel a little bit like an outsider. My situation reminds me a little bit of the story I like to tell of a guest preacher at an important parish event. He thought he had prepared well, he thought he had the right message, he thought he had delivered it well, and as was the custom, he and the pastor stood at the back of the church when Mass was over, and folks were very gracious, very kind, very complimentary. But at the very end of the line, a gentleman came up and shook his hand and said, you talk way too fast, you had nothing to say, and it wasn't very helpful. Well, obviously this concerned the preacher. He turned to the pastor and he said, who is this guy and what is his problem? And the pastor said, oh, don't worry about him. He just goes around repeating what everybody else is saying. So I know I'll talk too fast. I want time for Peter and questions. I hope I have something to say, and I hope it might be helpful, but I'm not going to stand in the back when this is over. In fact, I'm going to have to leave immediately after this session, but I have a very good excuse. I'm taking my son to the Notre Dame Navy game tomorrow evening back in Washington, so I think that counts. We got to begin with mission. What brings us together today is not politics, it's not ideology. We're a community of faith and reason. We're not another interest group. So what brings us together in a real sense is the Word of God and the teaching of His church. We are not the Democratic Party of Prayer. We are not the religious caucus of the Republican Party. I apologize for the PowerPoint. I know I'm violating all the rules here, but I wanted to share, for the most part, Pope Francis' own words. And I saw the mission of this wonderful organization. It's an impressive mission, but it is not the best mission I've ever seen. The best mission I've ever seen was Jesus' mission, where he said in his own hometown synagogue in Nazareth, and I think we need to begin here, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has sent me to bring good news to the poor, liberty to captives, new sight to the blind, and set the downtrodden free. That was his mission on earth. That is our mission today. This mission is not new. It is anchored in the Word of God. It's as old as the prophets. You can feel the passion for the poor in the Old Testament. It is as clear as Matthew 25, where the Lord said we would be judged on our treatment of the hungry, the homeless, and the poor. I would suggest the good news is that this mission is more clear and more visible now than at any time since the Sermon on the Mount. I think a lot of that, we just declared two saints, St. John the 23rd, St. John Paul II. They both, in their own ways, were giants in this area. Benedict XVI, I think, is very much underrated as a teacher, a social teacher. And now we have the simple ways and the powerful words of St. Francis, who in many ways is a walking, talking parable of the church's social teaching. The bad news is that for many of us, this is sort of a vague abstraction. We ought to be nice. We ought to care for the poor. We do not understand the principles, the substance, the ideas behind that. I remember when I worked for Cardinal Hickey in Washington, we invited people, doctors in, to help them work to take care of the homeless and the people without medical care. And one of them said, I don't understand why this is the work of the church. Are these people Catholic? Are they members of our parishes? And the cardinal looked at him and said, we serve the homeless, we feed the hungry, we stand with the poor, not because they are Catholic, but because we are. I know who asked that question. He was a graduate of this university. How is it that for so many of us, we don't know this heritage, or we know it only in its broadest strokes? I think that's changing. I think it's changing in part because of Pope Francis. I had an opportunity, for reasons I don't understand, to spend 6 months as a residential fellow at Harvard University, the Institute for Politics. I don't know what a fellow does at Notre Dame, but at Harvard you eat and you talk. And I'm a natural-born fellow. It was a wonderful experience. But there was a real hunger for what we're talking about today. And after I left, they came back and they had a panel on the Pope. And it'd be fair to say Harvard doesn't have a lot of panels on popes. And please don't take offense at this, but it was in many ways a typical academic panel in that everybody pretended they saw it coming. That was going to be from Latin America. Jesuit was no big surprise. An old pope was no big surprise. And I said, wait a minute. When I left here, if I had written a book that chapter 1 was the Pope resigned for the first time in 600 years. Chapter 2, we followed an old Jesuit on the bus in Argentina. Chapter 3, he was elected Pope, chose the name Francis. And chapter 4, he began his papacy at a prison on Holy Thursday, washing the feet. What do you think people would have said about my book? The nicest thing they would have said is, don't waste your time. I think it's a pretty good story. I wonder how it's going to turn out. When we think of Pope Francis' message, we ought to think of the very beginning. There are rules. You're not supposed to talk about what happens in a conclave. I think it's mortal sin. But the Pope felt perfectly free to talk about what happened, and he described what happened as the votes mounted, when things were looking dangerous, he said. His best friend leaned over, gave him a hug, a kiss, and said, don't forget the poor. And Francis says, that's when it came to me. I'll call myself Francis. Francis is a man of peace. He is a man of poverty. He's a man who protects creation. How I would like a church which is poor and for the poor. And from the very beginning, Pope Francis has placed the poor at the center of his leadership. And he believes the poor ought to be at the center of the church's life. He said in The Joy of the Gospel, I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and clinging to its own security. He talks constantly about going to the peripheries. He talks a lot about the economy. He said, just as the commandment, thou shalt not kill, sets a clear limit in order to safeguard the value of human life, today we have to say, thou shalt not, to an economy of exclusion and inequality. Such an economy kills. How can it not be news when a homeless person dies? And as we have been discussing, he goes to the structural dimensions of poverty that cannot be delayed. Welfare projects, this was cited last evening, which meet certain needs are considered temporary responses as long as the problems of the poor are not radically resolved by rejecting the absolute autonomy of markets. No solution will be found. And as was said last night, inequality is the root of social ills. He talks about workers. Just 2 days ago, gave one of the longest presentations he's made as Pope. And he talked about economics and poverty and workers. Every worker, whether he is part of the formal system of paid work, has the right to fair remuneration, Social Security, and a pension. Even the people on the fringes of the economy, he suggests, should not be excluded from employment rights, from building trade unions. And the Holy Father unites his voice to theirs and says we are to accompany them in their struggle. In the same presentation 2 days ago, he said it's not possible to tackle poverty by promoting containment strategies, rendering the poor domesticated, harmless, and passive. There's a more concrete desire that every mother and father has for land, housing, and work. He said, it's strange when I talk like this, there are those who think the Pope is a communist. Solidarity means fighting the structural causes of poverty, inequality. It means facing the destructive effects of an empire of money. And we are all called to transform those structures. So I would try and summarize Pope Francis' directions simplistically is he looks at the world, he looks at the economy, he looks at the church from the bottom up, from the outside in, from the least of these to the rest of us, to the most of us. He says we shouldn't be obsessed with certain issues, but there is no retreat on the protection of human life and family life. He constantly talks about encounter and engagement. We have to see the pain, the humanity of the poor. He talks a lot about structural causes and exclusion, and more than any recent pope, talks about the evil, talks about devil, and talks about mercy and joy. He said Christians have a plan of action 2 days ago. I recommend you read it. It's called the Beatitudes. Well, it's not a bad plan of action, but we have more to offer than that. I would suggest that the assets of the Catholic community, a university like Notre Dame, the universities you're a part of, are a part of a different set of assets. In Washington, money, power, access. I think our assets are different. I think we have everyday experience with the poor. Who shelters the homeless? Who feeds the hungry? Who educates the young? Who welcomes immigrants? We're the largest non-governmental provider of education, healthcare, and human services. We are everywhere. We have presence, we have structures, we have institutions like this university, like parishes, like Catholic charities. And we're a large community, 60-some million of us, and we have leaders. Leaders of this university, leaders of this diocese, and a particularly powerful leader in Pope Francis and his predecessors. But in many ways, the most important asset we have is not those things. It is a set of ideas. It is a moral framework. The Bible says, without a vision, the people perish. Well, we have a powerful vision. It is politically incorrect. It doesn't fit the categories of right and left, Democrat or Republican. It is both clear and complex. With all due respect to our evangelical brothers and sisters, it is a lot more complicated than what would Jesus do. There are people in this room who could footnote every one of these documents. This is what the church has done over the last 125 years to try and apply that teaching to our own times. I would suggest that the most important word in Catholic social teaching is the word and-d. Human life and dignity, human rights and responsibilities, family and community, the priority for the poor and the vulnerable, the dignity of work and the rights of workers, solidarity and subsidiarity, care for the planet and the poorest people on the planet. And as we discussed in the last section, all those ands come together in what we call the common good. I think one of the terrible temptations in our society, in our church, perhaps in our own lives, is to separate life and dignity, rights and responsibilities, solidarity and subsidiarity. Why is this not changing? There we go. The Pope embraces those principles, says every life is sacred, The unborn should not be thrown away. The elderly should not be thrown away. The poor, the migrants, the imprisoned. He talks about the throwaway society. He says the Pope loves everybody, rich and poor, but he has a special obligation in the name of Christ to remind us that we have to help, respect, and promote the poor. The measure of a society is found in the way it treats those most in need, those who have nothing apart from their poverty. With all due respect, those are not the priorities of the Senate Finance Committee. He warns us, we're not just talking about nourishment or dignified subsistence. It means education, access to health care, and above all, employment, because that expresses and enhances our dignity, and that employment ought to come with a just wage. He not only deplores the economy of exclusion, he talked about trickle-down theories, he is a fervent foe of corruption. We need to resolve the structural causes, and what is needed is an integral promotion of the poor, which goes beyond a simple welfare mentality. Our goal cannot be for everyone to be on food stamps. It is that everyone would have work, that you could raise a family in dignity. The Catholic bishops a while ago tried to describe an approach to ending poverty, to addressing poverty, and they used the image of a table in two ways: that everybody ought to have a place at the table, and that the framework for overcoming poverty is like a table with four legs. The first leg is what individuals and families need to do, and we talked about that: sacrifice for children, wise decisions, marriage, education, work, the skills, the virtues, the character that was discussed last night. The second leg is what mediating institutions need to do: community institutions, churches, neighborhoods. Somebody mentioned trade unions in the last session. To support and help families, to in fact confront injustice that arises at the local level. The third leg of the table is the market, employees, the private sector, that provide jobs, that provide wages and decent working conditions in retirement. Unions and other associations, part of the market. Work ought to be an escape from poverty, not another form of poverty. And then the final leg of the table is government at every level, that needs to provide a safety net, needs to protect against injustice and discrimination, and act where the other institutions fail. The Catholic end, all these institutions need to work together. The problem with Washington, in my experience, is everyone's in love with one leg of the table: personal responsibility, mediating institutions, the market, or government. It's not the Catholic way. So the Pope reminds us that we have to be involved in political life. It's a moral obligation. It's one of the highest forms of charity, and it focuses on the common good. And he specifically says, I beg the Lord to grant us more politicians who are disturbed by the state of society and the lives of the poor. It's vital that government leaders and others work to ensure that all citizens have work, education, and health care. Our little initiative, less than a year old, in Georgetown, is trying to share this teaching more broadly, more deeply, and to reach out to a new generation of Catholic leaders to help them become salt, light, and leaven in public life. We have a series of dialogues. We've drawn 3,000 people to 6 dialogues. We're doing sessions for young people in public life, work on the Hill, in the administration. There are a lot of students in Notre Dame and other institutions in Washington who came with a sense of vocation. But for this purpose, the most important thing we are doing is trying to gather evangelical leaders and Catholic leaders to confront the silence on poverty and the stalemate on poverty between those who focus mostly on family factors and those who focus mostly on economic factors. When anyone who is poor, works with the poor, knows that a child's prospects are shaped by the choices of her parents and by the policies of her government. We're going to bring these leaders together around the idea of the moral, policy, and political imperative of "and" when it comes. While I've tried to outline the principles and directions that come from the Holy Father, it would be exceedingly important to remember that he calls for direct engagement. And some of us, I speak for myself, feel we work on this, that's enough. No one must say that they cannot be close to the poor because of their own lifestyle, demands more attention to other areas. This is an excuse commonly heard in academic circles, business, professional, or ecclesial circles. None of us can think we are exempt from concern for the poor and social justice. Let me conclude with a story. I gave a talk in New York to a group of business leaders, and I thought I had outlined the principles of Catholic social thought. This was before Francis and the urgency and priority is brought to it. And I thought the talk had gone well. I sat down, people were very gracious, except one guy who was clearly angry. And unfortunately, he was the president of the group, and unfortunately, I was seated next to him. And I said, what's the problem? He said, you don't want to know. And frankly, by then, I didn't want to know. But I said, no, tell me. He said, I'm tired of all this talk about the poor, immigrants, the unborn, the undocumented. What about me? What about people like me who pay the bills, work hard, go to Mass every Sunday? Is there anything in those encyclicals for me? And I responded eloquently. I talked about Matthew 25. I talked about John Paul II, Mother Teresa. I was getting nowhere. Finally, I said, what do you do for a living? He said, I'm a lawyer. Turns out he was the managing partner of a major law firm. And I said, you work late. Do you ever see the person who cleans your office? He says, yes. I said, tell me about that person. He says, it's an immigrant, a woman. I don't know much about her. I said, what do you pay her? He said, well, we don't really pay her. We hire a firm, they hire her. I said, come on, what do you think she makes? He said, probably minimum wage. I said, does your firm have a health plan? He says, yes, a good one, covers families, costs a lot of money. I said, does the woman who cleans your office, vacuums your rugs, scrubs your toilet, is she part of your plan? Can she take her kids to the doctor when they get sick? He said, I told you. We hire the firm, they hire her. He said, no, she's not part of our plan. He said, what are you getting at? I said, what I'm getting at is this is not about politics or ideology. This is about whether the woman who cleans your office, whether she and her husband can raise their kids with dignity, whether they can take their kids to the doctor when they get sick. And he said, why didn't you say so? I think the challenge for all of us is to make sure that no one close to our church can say, why didn't you say so? Thank you.
I get to look at why didn't you say so, and so do you. This is good. I am so glad to be here at Notre Dame. My dear friend Carter Sneed got me to come. And Carter, you could ask me to do just about anything, but this is really very special for me to be with you and to be with my dear friend John Carr. We've been at things for a very, very long time together, including the fact that he told you about St. Paul in Minnesota and Minneapolis. And it turned out we hadn't known each other very long and discovered that we grew up not at the same time, but one street away from each other in Minneapolis. So it's a bond. It's a very, very close and warm bond. We in our house, my wife is the daughter of a Protestant minister, Baptist minister, and I'm a grandson and on back of rabbis. Although I think that if we weren't religious but had the same values We just are so excited about the Pope. Absolutely. For all of the leadership in all of the faiths, indeed all of the moral leadership in our country now, if we think about it, we're so lacking. And to have this Pope come along and say what you all know and what John has described is a wonderful thing for this world. So I'm especially happy to be here. We need a stronger voice of faith, all faiths, in dealing with these questions of poverty in our country and in our world. We also need the secular voice. We need the commitment, the moral commitment, the political commitment, no matter what the basis is from it. There's no monopoly on approaching it from a faith perspective and from deep religious belief, but it's equally important for people who don't have the same kind of commitment. And if I say that we don't have the kind of moral leadership that we need from the faith community, we don't have the kind of moral leadership that we need from the non-faith community. It's a challenge to everyone. I want to also say that the chance to hear Professor McIntyre, to get here in time, was not only inspirational for me, but also it's very important that I heard what he said, because I'm going to say a lot of the same things. So pedagogy, good pedagogy, does include some repetition, and so I think that it's brilliant, Carter, to schedule John and me after Professor McIntyre. I want to put what John said, of course, what the Pope has said, the context here that we have into kind of a historical frame that I hope is helpful to all of us in thinking about these issues, about poverty in the United States. You know, it's 50 years, we all know, since our country declared war on poverty. And we also know that it's become much repeated that we fought a war on poverty and poverty won. And I think in the politics and the public discussion right now, all of us who care about making a difference about poverty need to understand that that statement is wrong. We did not lose. And I want to go through that. Now, the fact is, we have, by the way we measure poverty, we have 45 million people in our country who are in poverty. And so, in a prima facie way, in a presumptive way, the statement that we lost that war seems to have substance to it. And that's what I want to talk about. First of all, what we've done that has made and continues to make a huge difference. In the 1960s, the time obviously when Lyndon Johnson did make that historic commitment for our country, in 1959, when we started to measure, and it's only then that we started to actually try to measure poverty in our country, we had 22% of our people who lived in poverty. By 1973, it was down to 11%. We did some things, including a very, very hot economy during that period of time, including the results of the civil rights movement, the civil rights revolution in our country. African American poverty went down from 55% in 1959 to 31% in 1973. These are very tangible things that we did. And when you fast forward to today, the fact is that without the public benefits that we do have, the number of people who would be in poverty in our country would be twice what it is, would be more than 90 million people. Our public policies are making a difference, And it's not just the 1960s, it starts with Social Security in the 1930s. It goes on through, actually, in one way or another, including even President Reagan on this. Public policies in the way of food stamps and the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit and housing vouchers and SSI for people with disabilities, Pell Grants, long list of things are making a difference, And so you would ask, anyone would ask, well, if we've done so well, why do we still have 45 million people living in poverty in this country? So if you look back to 1968, which I'm among a small number in the room can do that. I see some beautiful white hair over there. With all the tragedies that we had of losing Dr. King and losing Robert Kennedy and others during that period of time, and the division in our country with the war in Vietnam and all of that, as to poverty, with those numbers that I told you, we really had an optimistic sense that we were moving in the right direction. So what happened? And I want to just fairly quickly take you through 9 things that I think we did not foresee. Very important, I think, that we understand this history, because despite the things that I'm going to lay out for you, by the time we get to the end of President Clinton's presidency, and with my disagreement that was mentioned in the introduction about the welfare law, the 11.1% that we had achieved in 1973 was back to 11.3% in the year 2000. And that's in the wake of a whole series of things that I'm going to lay out for you. The last 14 years, not so good. We had 31 million people who were poor in 2000. As we know, first over the course of until the Great Recession started, another 6 million, and then another 9 million people lost to poverty in the Great Recession, and only now beginning to go a million less in 2013, 2012. So why did we only break even, if you will? Well, number one, the biggest thing that happened, which we did not foresee, and Professor McIntyre talked about it, and we know, and John talked about that woman who works in that law firm. We did not foresee the fundamental change in our economy, namely that we've become a low-wage nation. Over the 40-year period beginning in the early 70s, and we all know what it is, globalization, technology, the weakening of unions, all of these things happen to create a low-wage economy. 106 million people in our country, a third of our people, live on an income that's below twice the poverty line, that's below $39,000 for a family of 3. So that's a lot of people. And they have been stuck. The median wage in this country, half the jobs in this country pay less than $35,000 a year, and that's if you have the job full-time and all year. $35,000. A quarter of the jobs in the country pay less than the poverty line for a family of four, below $24,000. These are really, I would say, stunning facts. And people have just plain been stuck. The American dream of mobility, we still talk it, and we talk about bringing people into the middle class, and that's true, we'd like to do that. But the real fact is we're not being honest about what's going on. The wage, that median wage, went up over a 40-year period by a grand total of 7%. Total, 1/5% a year. No wonder people are so angry out there. No wonder we have so much anger in our politics. And so, that's number one. Number two, that happened in the same frame, and it is what's happened to the family structure in our country. And this, of course, John talked a little about it, and we can talk more, very complicated in a lot of ways. But one thing that's very simple is that there are millions of women out there who cannot, all by themselves, who cannot earn enough money to support their children. The poverty level for women with children is over 40%, higher than any racial or ethnic group, 27% African American, 25% Latino, similar, Native America. Single moms with children, over 40%. That's a terrible combination of being a low-wage nation and having so many single moms who are out there struggling. Only one breadwinner. This is really, the flood of low-wage work, it's just a disaster for women and children. Think about lacking the wherewithal to pay for quality child care, which is a major need in our country. So many women have to leave their children in circumstances that are downright dangerous. We have a lot to do. Third, public education. Professor McIntyre talked about public education, about education generally. What's happened for low-wage children, and we all know it again, is that our education system went into decline for children, especially in inner cities, especially for children of color. Just at the time when we really needed to have much more rigorous education and training for the jobs of the 21st century. So, all of our children and young people need access to 21st century career and technical education, not only to go to a terrific college, a Harvard or Yale, and then go and do something good for the world, but the jobs that are available in a broader way at the same time. That's what we need to do to create an educational system that where young people can compete for the jobs of the 21st century, starting with 0 to 5, which is so important, and you heard that last night. But it's not only 0 to 5. You don't stop at age 5. You go all the way through. Fourth, we started locking up people, especially young men of color, at a prodigious rate. And of course, it's a vicious circle because poverty, especially when coupled with race, leads to disproportionate incarceration, and incarceration leads to what, for too many people, when they get out of prison, a lifetime of continued poverty. We did not foresee this. Think about that. All of these things were things, if we had a conversation in 1968, we would not have predicted any of these things. Inner city poverty has gotten worse. I think it's our biggest failure in terms of poverty across the country and communities across the country is not being sufficiently responsive. And so we now have, if you want to look at a recent book, Stuck in Place by Patrick Sharkey, because in fact, the children of the first generation who were stuck in those inner city neighborhoods, the persistent intergenerational poverty, it's worse in the next generation. It's a huge, and it means multidimensional, certainly empowerment of people in the community, and it's about jobs and it's about education for jobs, but it's also about the criminal justice system. It's also about every aspect of life that all has to be taken on. And we have continuing rural poverty. Professor McIntyre talked about the farm workers. We have increased suburban poverty. All of these place-based things are part of those challenges. Now, I will say, as to concentrated poverty, we knew about that in 1968. That has not been a surprise. The surprise is that we haven't done enough to respond. And then deep poverty. People with incomes below, this is the counterpart of those 106 million that are twice the poverty line. Incomes below half the poverty line, below $9,500 for a family of 3. Disproportionately women and children again. And why? This is one that we did to ourselves as a country. And that is that we, with all the problems that there were in the welfare system, the old aid to families with dependent children, and there were serious problems, we made it worse. And so if you look now, when we started after 1996 with the Personal Responsibility Act and the so-called temporary assistance for needy families, in 1995, 68% of children living in poor families were getting some cash assistance. Now it's down to 25%. Half the states in our country have fewer than 20% of children in poor families who are receiving cash assistance. State of Wyoming is the dubious winner of a prize. They have 5%. They have 800 people in the entire state of Wyoming getting cash assistance. And so as a result of that, we have 6 million people in this country whose only income is from food stamps. And of course, what's happened now is that food stamps, which were bipartisan, starting in 1967, and I went to Mississippi with Robert Kennedy in 1967, and we saw children with bellies that were swollen, sores on their arms and legs that would not heal, and as a result of that, the country took note. President Nixon sent the first presidential message to Congress asking for a national food stamp program. It was always a bipartisan program, through Bob Dole saving it in the 1980s, through George W. Bush increasing the funding for food stamps. And now it's become, for one of our political parties, something that we attack. It responded in the recession and went from 26 million people to 48 million people on food stamps because there's a legal right to receive food stamps and there were people in need. Do you know what happened to TANF during that period of time? It went from 3.9 million people to 4.4 million people. 500,000 extra people got help, and not evenly across the states even. Some states paid less, had fewer people during that time. So that is a disgrace, and one that we need to challenge. Another thing we did not contemplate was homelessness in our country. I mean, there were always people, and if you go back to the Depression, obviously it was terrible, terrible. But in a prosperous time, post-war America, some of it was that we had some blinders on, I will say, but we destroyed affordable housing, and we have a huge shortage of affordable housing now. We didn't foresee that we would be in that position with all of our prosperity. And then two last things. One is you cannot talk about poverty if you don't talk about race and if you don't talk about gender. And when you talk about gender, you're really talking about women and children. I said about the percentage of those households, children are the poorest age group in our country now. And of course, as to race, it's not only the numbers which I mentioned earlier, but it's the ugly politics that we still have. We've made great progress on race in our country. We all believe that. But when you come to the intersection of race and poverty, that's the most dangerous intersection in America. So we're not going to get anywhere unless we have an honest discussion about the structural racism that we have in relation to the criminal justice system, in relation to education, the implicit bias that we have in so many ways, race and gender. And finally, inequality. And we could go on for hours. Professor McIntyre made the point that we have had growth for people, tiny people. I'll repeat what he said, 140% increase in per capita income. And just in the coming out of the recession, the people from in the top 1% had a 21% increase in their income from 2009 to 2012. The entire bottom 99% had an increase of 0.3%, and you can believe me that it's not the same at 99 as it is at 1. And indeed, when we talk about inequality, the challenge is to say, remember when you talk about 99, you've got to go all the way down to 0 in your concern. I'm worried about our democracy. I'm worried about our future as a country. Again, echoing Professor McIntyre, the political power that comes from that concentration at the top, what they're able to do, what it means not only for our economy, but for our political system. So we need to confront all of those things that I have said. We can talk about remedies at length. We need public policy at all levels. We need private and civic action in all ways, and particularly in communities across the country. We will not get a system for child care in a community with federal money if we don't have civic action locally. We will not get young people from here to there in their education and get into the labor market. Again, there can be funding, but unless business and community colleges and high schools and civic leaders come together to create those systems. And then we must insist on personal responsibility, but in all ways, everybody. That law firm chair, managing partner, as well as everybody else. So much of this is civic and local, and I always emphasize that wherever I go to talk. I would close with my faith-based reference. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel is a great favorite of mine. He was a great friend of Dr. King. And he said, long before we had Twitter, but you can see how this could have been a tweet. He said, we're not all guilty, but we are all responsible. Thank you so much for the chance to be here and talk with you.
Thank you, Peter and John. We have time for some questions. Just please identify yourself. Yes, go ahead.
I'd like to ask, thank you for those two talks, brilliant talks. Just had a question for Mr. Edelman about, in your view, the history of, I know this is probably the question you get asked all the time, but in the way that you've discussed the history of American social policy, what is your take on the impact of welfare reform in 1996?
Well, I would, without specifically saying, but just to elaborate a little bit, it's a disaster. I'm done. No, I mean, what happened was, and you know, the politicians across both parties, more heavily in the Republican Party, but most Democrats as well, because the Democratic president signed it into law, and other than 11 or 12 senators, the only senator who voted against it who was up for election in 1996 was Paul Wellstone, the late Paul Wellstone. And also Ted Kennedy and Bill Bradley and Chris Dodd and others that you would expect. But such a small, so you have this kind of tacit agreement that it's a great success. It's not. The idea was that people who were on welfare should have jobs. Well, yeah, we all like that. I mean, that's the right thing. As many people who are able to work and jobs are available, and I would say that if jobs are not available, there ought to be a sensible public jobs program. Actually, I wouldn't make it only for people who were on cash assistance. I would make it broader. But what happened was that it became a tool just to push people off the rolls, and there are certainly states where they did very demeaning forced work programs that were not constructive at all. New York City, for example. And Bill de Blasio has just undone that now in the year 2014. Stuff that was put in the Giuliani years that Mayor Bloomberg didn't undo, because these attitudes are so negative. You know, there's such assumptions about people who are on poverty and the moms and so negative. So when I say to you that in Montana there's only 5% of the children, and I gave you the rest of the numbers, I'm just giving you the sort of frame around that, it basically doesn't exist anymore. That's the bottom line.
Peter took a very principled stand, a very unusual thing in Washington of not only writing a memo, but making clear that his opposition meant he couldn't participate anymore. My sense is less informed and in some ways less definitive. I think when the economy was growing and work was available, a lot of things happened. The dilemma is, now that we've hit a recession and we seem not to be able to emerge from it, the basic compact, which is those who can work should work, and you ought to be able to raise a family by your work. And those who cannot work need to have a basic floor. That has been undermined by years of stagnant economic life and some of the pressures that Peter mentioned. The statistics are overwhelming. I think it might even be worse. If you graduate from high school, if you wait to have a child until you're married, and if there's a worker in the home, you have an 8% chance as a child of growing up for poverty. If you don't graduate from high school, if you have a child before you're married, and if there isn't a worker in the home, it's an 80% chance. So when the Pope says work, education, family, wages, I think that is the recipe. One of the things that I've found, and one of the things we're trying to do by bringing together evangelical and Catholic leaders from across the spectrum, Jerry Falwell's University to Jim Wallace, you know, Opus Dei to the nuns on the bus, is see if we can't agree that this ought to be a priority. At lunch, I was talking with someone, and he said, everybody agrees on the principle, on the priority. We just differ on the means. I don't think we agree on the principle. I don't think we agree on the priority. With a couple exceptions, nobody in Washington talks about this in any serious way. But my sense is the first thing you have to do is break the silence, and the second thing you have to do is break the stalemate. You have folks over here who look at family structure and say, this is the core. And you have folks over here who look at the economy and say, that's the problem. And it's absolutely both, and they spend most of their time complaining about the other caucus, and none of the time working together. So it is my hope that religious leaders in the evangelical and Catholic community can make it clear that this is different. Robert Putnam, the Harvard sociologist, one of the people I got to meet when I was up at Harvard. When I went to Harvard, some of you may know, the head of the program said, I know you're a nut, I just don't know if you're a right-wing nut or a left-wing nut. I said, don't Google me. But it is going to take a combination of strategies to do this. But Putnam has looked primarily at white working class poverty, and he thinks the gaps are going to grow. He calls it the ultimate purple problem, that it is family, it is behaviors, it is economics, it is wages, it is work, and we got to find a way, one, to make this a priority, and two, to work across the ideological and political boundaries.
I just add, I know you have a question, but Bob Putnam's book, which is about the town that he grew up in, is Fort Clinton,
Yeah.
On the shores of Lake Erie. Some of you probably know it. A major point about that is that you now have here, this was a very successful community, industrial community. The workers in the manufacturing plants, their children all went to college. It was an American success story. And then everything from the bottom fell out. The manufacturing plants went away, and you started seeing kids growing up and dropping out of school and having kids too young and using drugs and more crime in the community, which he documents in the book. You absolutely read it when it comes out. It's not a race question. This is about what happens when there is no social capital. And so when you're going to come back to it, you know, the things that you said, John, and you know this perfectly well, and it's why they asked you that question about wingnut. Because these facts are that you recounted, which are correct, easily play into the hands of people with very simplistic, talking down, moralizing, forcing people to do this or that, which is just plain wrong. You have to figure out how to rebuild community, how to create economic opportunity, how to improve schools, how to get places either back to where they were before or in any case get them there. And it's hard work and it's not simple-minded.
Hi, my name is Leah. I'm from the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, so it was cool.
Yay, Minnesota.
Yeah, it was cool hearing you guys talk about that. So, just a quick question. How did your faith leader limit you in your path to your own leadership positions within public policy? I'm especially curious as a political science major as well. So.
How does faith affect?
Yeah, about your guys' path, sure.
Well, in two ways. One, I think faith gives you a different way of looking at the world. I think what Pope Francis is offering us, and I tried to say it, is you look at the world from the bottom up, from the outside in. And that's not the way we do it usually. The other thing is I'm a great admirer of humanitarian and folks who can make good judgments and tremendous contributions without faith. I can't. The restraints in my life come in large part because of my faith, my family, and my dreams for my own kids. And this is going to require some sacrifice. This is going to require reaching out to people we normally don't reach out to. And there are people who can do that without Matthew 25, without the Beatitudes. But I don't think I can. And that's why I think there's a particular responsibility. One of the things Bob Putnam said to me, and the head of the National Association of Evangelicals, he said, these are your kids. And we're talking, again, white working class, mostly evangelical or Catholic kids. My take on that is there are not a lot of Episcopalians in trailer parks. which I think might be true. But it is also true that, I'll speak for the Catholic community, we have been withdrawing from these kinds of communities. We have been consolidating schools and closing schools. We have to ask our universities, who do we prize as the people who ought to get a great education? What is our definition of our mission? If we can find somebody, people who have the qualities that we talked about last night, the behaviors, the virtues, the ability to work in a team and all that, who come from a disadvantaged background but don't have the greatest test scores, they belong here. They belong in our schools and in our communities. And we got to find a way to make that happen. So for me, it gives me a way of looking at the world. It frankly also gives me responsibility to cross some of the ideological boundaries. Pope Francis, he's very generous. He talks about mercy and all this. He is very tough on ideologues. He said, ideologues are teachers without wisdom, ethicists without morals, and don't even talk about beauty. Well, that's as tough as it gets. So I think we have to, in some ways, be very careful that we don't select our facts and our remedies based on our political preferences and ideology. Peter is extraordinary. I spend most of my time with my progressive friends saying you're ignoring the family, human, moral dimensions of this, and most of my time with my conservative friends saying there are economic structures that keep people poor. If there are no jobs and the jobs we have wages that you can't support a family, it doesn't do much good to say everybody ought to work.
If I can also say a word about building on what John just said. I give you a much shorter answer, but it's complicated because I don't know myself. I mean, I have very strong Jewish roots. I went to synagogue, I went to Hebrew-speaking camp. I've been very active on Israel, on peace issues, social justice issues in Israel for the last 25 years, although not actually before that. So there's something Jewish going on here. But I think, I hope it's right, that I would be doing exactly what I was doing if I were completely secular. So that's on that. But on the thing that where John and I do feel like we're sometimes like we're in a kind of not very big middle together. This whole question of family support really needs much more attention because, you know, Paul Ryan made this big proposal a couple months ago, 4 months ago. And he talked about neighborhood centers, and when you looked at it in detail, there's a sort of germ of an idea there, except it's completely misapplied. So he talks about, well, we'll take food stamps and housing vouchers and child care and federal, and we'll throw them all into one block grant, and the state can decide. Well, no, there's a reason why we have separate programs. And he said that we'll have these centers in communities, and everybody who wants help has to come and get a case manager. Well, wrong. Some people need help, some people of other kinds, surely, yes, but not everybody. And so there are models that are coming up around the country. There's something called the Youth Policy Institute in Los Angeles that's run by a guy with a fabulous name named Dixon Slingerland. They have pomodores. Which is he didn't invent, but these are people who are out. They're kind of organizers. They're out in the community, reaching out to families and finding out, not in some lecturing way, finding out the kinds of things about that they need help. And then they have centers that are strategically located in the three large. He has 1,200 employees. I mean, it's a very big deal. And there's a woman named Roseanne Haggerty in New York who's in the name of preventing homelessness. She's a homelessness person and a supportive housing person. They're in Brownsville and in Hartford, they're doing the same kind of thing. And so we need to get that, we need to have a, a serious, bring that up and talk about it.
Just a quick comment. One, I'm more impressed with Paul Ryan's efforts. I think he's come a long way. I think he is raising this issue consistently. I don't agree with all his remedies, but I don't think the status quo is adequate. I actually think he will be part of an effort to try and find an alternative way out of this. What we need are other partners. I hope the President of the United States will make this his legacy. Because of who he is, where he comes from, and what he stands for, this could be the work of a lifetime. But we need people from both parties, from a variety of different perspectives, to say this is a moral test for our country.
So you found a difference.
Yeah. We have time for one very quick question.
Well, I don't know if this is a quick one, but I'm Michael Ginder. I'm a cultural anthropologist here at Notre Dame. I'm going to ask the converse of the first question, not instead of asking about welfare reform. What about, would you favor us going back to the pre-welfare reform program? There were disadvantages with that, so I'm kind of, what's your alternative to that? And there was an issue with, a little bit of an issue with dependence.
Sure. Yes.
What else do we have?
We had 3.3 million people who were on welfare when President Clinton took office. That's way too many in a country our size. We're down under 4 million people now. That's just barely 1% of people in the country. What was wrong with the old, there were a bunch of things wrong. For one thing, before I get to the sort of heart of it, but it's pretty important, the states were setting the benefit levels, and in Mississippi, the benefit level was at 11% of the poverty line, and there were a bunch of states like that. So given the fact that the states could set the benefits, it was, in some places, it was a very inadequate program from an income point of view. But the biggest thing that was wrong with it is that in a useful, constructive way, and John has already talked about this, if a little indirectly, is that we should be helping people who are on cash assistance. We should be working with them as individuals. And in many, many cases, in that hot economics period of the last half of the 90s, moms who were on welfare, you could see the statistics go up because they wanted to work. And there were jobs available, and they went out to work. The welfare thing had some, I mean, there's a lot of research on this, had maybe 20% to do with it, but it was really about the economy providing opportunities. Anyway, if you look, there's a woman named Toby Herr in Chicago, and working with people, what's your need? What do you need to be able to find a job? That's the heart of it. It's a work-oriented proposal that's also a safety net for people who, for one reason or another, are not in a position to work, or they're just in between jobs. And then really work with people. Do you need some job training? Do you need drug treatment? Do you need, there's so many people who are clinically depressed. Do you need some mental health help? Those kinds of things. And the old program did not do that. So that's the heart of it.
Well, please join me in thanking John Carr and Peter Edelman.